Welcome to my review of the 2013 video game Stick It to the Man. There will be zero spoilers in the review. I haven't decided yet if I'm going to do a thoughts section or video. If I do, I will verbally warn before getting into any spoilers. The game, I've been a little unsure, but I think it must be at least rated teen, because there's at least one thing in there that feels like that. But at the same time, M for mature feels high because there's not that much there. I'm gonna go with teen, both for what I believe the game is rated and for what the video will be. This is a game that I absolutely loved, and happy LGBTQIA plus pride. I want to briefly acknowledge that I do appreciate technically it does not appear that the player character, or at least a number of other major characters in this, are members of the community. But I would definitely say thematically it fits for the, yeah. Maybe you will agree. I'm going to briefly describe sort of the core concept. So you play as Ray, and he has had some negative experiences in his life. He's just trying to, you know, like he's a nice guy who wants others to have good experiences, and he's just, he's got a job, he's trying to just live, you know, a more or less normal life. He's trying not to like ask for much. But there's just something that complicates that isn't really his own fault, but it's also not something like inherently negative. It has him perceiving the world in a way that is deemed unusual, and there are these seemingly government, representatives who are trying to, you know, catch him because of this specific, very unusual aspect about him. And, over the course of it, we see very much that he is capable of, doing things for other people that, though deemed unusual, certainly, you know, I mean, I wouldn't, I'm not gonna say that it's always like exclusively helping every single individual you come across, but there's a good balance, and certainly he's not like making the world a worse place. He's doing his best, and a lot of the time it works out. Certainly a lot of the people he encounters are much better off, and a decent amount of time the ones who don't kind of come off as they're not necessarily the nicest people, so yeah, I'm not saying it's a perfect one-to-one, but I feel like there's a lot of themes there that fit Pride. Now, right, I wanted to note, so I played this on PC. It was free on Epic a while back, and the the genre is one of those. So I've noticed that in somewhat recently, and I appreciate in video game terms, 2013 was light years away, but they've they've done this thing in somewhat recent years where you can't necessarily make there are certain genres where if you just make a game within that genre, I mean, I can imagine it today, and back in 2013, it probably just doesn't sell quite as well as at the heyday. I've seen this described as a point and click. I mostly agree. It's just got a couple of things that make it, somewhat unusual. Um, so basically, yeah, I'm gonna briefly go over each of them. So other than point and click, there's definitely a stealth element and a platforming element, and there, it's a double-edged sword because on the one hand, that means that you can attract players who like at least one of these genres. But on the other hand, you might alienate a bunch that only usually play one of these genres. I have met my share of, gamers throughout my life, and while personally I love all three of the genres here, I've met a bunch that only, they're only into one of them and maybe even really can't stand the others. It is definitely an interesting combination. And it's almost kind of too bad. It's one of those games where I think there are a number of people who would love to play all the way through this, but from reading reviews, it seems they just got stuck on one of these three, genres, and that was kind of it. And, yeah, I don't know. I think if it would be very difficult to make the game so that you can just bypass sections that require this. Ultimately, I mean, if you're just there for the story, if the interactivity is not that important to you, video walkthroughs are a thing. But I do feel bad for people who wanted to see all that this had to offer and ultimately stopped because of either specifically the inclusion of one of these three or just the handling. So let's talk more in detail about that. So the point and click, I've seen at least one reviewer just describe it as tedious, and it's hard to argue. It's essentially, and I believe that was what this person ended up saying as well, the writing carries you through it. Carried them through it, carried me through it. Because, it is, so basically, when you are solving puzzles in this, you are using the invisible pink spaghetti arm, trademarked, by the game, not me, that enables you to read minds, Every time you come across a character, you hold down the E button, press one of the brains that you can see, and you'll hear their thoughts, and it will sometimes just be, something amusing, but a decent amount of the time, it's a hint towards something, and maybe even, a basic, yeah, I need to explain a little more before I can proceed, but yeah, it might provide a hint as to what you're supposed to do there. And the sometimes it's by reading someone's mind, sometimes it's by doing something for them, but one of the main ways you get the only thing you have in your your inventory, whatever the emphasis is, you get stuff for it by well, yeah. There's two ways. Sometimes you do find stuff just out there that you could just grab with the arm. Other times it is someone's thought, and sometimes you get the thought just by reading their mind. Sometimes you have to do something in order to make them think the thing. And one of the fun things about this is that once you grab something with the arm, it becomes, let's see, you can grab a thought and make it real, and you can grab a real thing and turn it into a thought. And, there's a commentary there on, how big a part of, like, I'm not going to quote Nietzsche on you, don't worry, but there is a certain connection between our will and, what ends up, happening. Actually, yeah, I guess maybe it's not so much Nietzsche, but there is a thing about, like, perception defining your reality, And I don't know, I appreciate the fact that it is exclusively outside intervention in this game. Like, it's always you getting others, in a specific state of mind. And yeah, a lot of the time you are solving problems other people have, and sometimes it's something where they don't even quite admit that they have the problem, but to you as the player, it's like, oh, this needs to change, and so you do it. And yeah, I did also consider doing this for mental health awareness, but I don't know. Overall, I felt it fit better here. But I'm actually not 100% sure if I'm gonna do one specifically for mental health awareness this year. We'll see. But yeah, that I think pretty much covers. So yeah, basically, you're going around, you're reading people's minds and getting thoughts and objects, and you're figuring out where to put what object, and ultimately you can basically always, like, near the end, that it gets to be really tiring if you are still doing that or decide to start doing that. But hypothetically, you could brute force this, and there definitely were some puzzles where I struggled at first to see how that was supposed to be the solution. And yeah, the stealth is one of those. So it is at least not exclusively the kind of stealth where ideally supposed to never be spotted. Like, this is not, early thief game kind of stealth, even though it is also line of sight. It does not, there's nothing with, like, audio. It is purely enemies might see you, but a decent amount of the time you're actually supposed to let enemies see you and then just win the chase that ensues. And in stealth, you can sometimes read the minds of at least one of the people, of one of these agents after you, and if they're thinking of something, that might help you. And yeah, it's that classic of, you can technically knock them out, but it's by finding one who's thinking about sleep, and then, you grab that, you put that on, not necessarily the same one, but one of the guards, and put them to sleep. And I did think they did a really good job spacing out the stealth, but again, I mean, I've loved stealth for decades now. I guess 2.5 decades by now. So if you're not into stealth, this is probably not one that's going to be super pleasant for you. It is. I saw at least one fellow reviewer describe it as uneven. Now, personally, I did think, while I was at times frustrated by it, I never really felt like, okay, this just shouldn't be in the game. Like, considering the overall length of the game, I do think the amount of stealth is neither too high nor too low. And let's see, I think that does bring us to the platforming. So the platforming that is a genre that I've been playing for 30 years now. Actually, slightly more than that. So I I want to acknowledge that it is impressive for indie. I've seen ones from indies that were released that were not quite, they were just okay. This is better than okay, but it is not amazing. One of the things is that, yeah, so it kind of goes back and forth between being jumps that kind of just exist so that you're doing something other than just walking, like they aren't even remotely challenging, to then ones that can be, but primarily because the kind of, I mean, it's not, I think the word jank would be going too far, but it is like just a tiny bit. I want to acknowledge, it didn't really screw up very many of my jumps, but there is this thing where, let's see, I think maybe the word is floaty. You know, the way that, yeah, it just feels sometimes like you're jumping a tiny bit short compared to how much you're pressing the directional key kind of thing. But, as someone who, like, I was frustrated by stealth games, yeah, 30 years ago. So, platforming games, when they just had stuff that was, like, terrible. This was never quite that for me, but it's also, like, I would definitely say each of the different elements, if it wasn't for the funny writing, I would not be playing this game for any one of those elements. And, if someone made a serious remake of this, like, good luck. I would not, play it unless they made sure to improve. You know, yeah, that is, yeah. Now, the I will also say it fits well, so once again, if we're reading it for pride, the the stealth, do I have to expand on? I guess I'll just very briefly, yeah, a number of members of the LGBTQIA plus community have to, you know, they live in a situation, in a social environment where they have to hide the thing that, this part of their identity that obviously in real life they should not be ashamed of. They should not feel like they have to hide at all. And let's see. Yeah, I really appreciate that it is specifically like, this kind of shadowy government organization, and that's not really. It's made clear very, very early on that that's what's going on. They don't look like cops. The fact that that's what yeah, that it is the government, out to stop this member of the LGBTQI plus community that is not really setting out to hurt anyone. Like, at the start of the game, something dramatic happens, and Ray is kind of just trying to figure things out. You could say his egg was cracked. He was forced out of the closet or some, and immediately, like, a bunch of people react, you know, negatively. But whenever he's just allowed to be himself and exercise this new part of his identity, as mentioned, like, he helps a pretty decent amount of people over the course of this. And let's see, I think that does. Yeah, the characters are a very real strength here. Over the course of it, I mean, I didn't count, but it must be over a dozen individuals, maybe 2 dozen. And, like many other point and clicks, you do get some sense of who they are. Like, this doesn't really have like dialogue trees, so obviously it is not to the same extent as those. But yeah, you read their minds and find out find out something about them. And that is one of the main places where you have comedy in this. And it is one of those games. So I want to make it clear, I don't want to be like the joke police. Most of what I'm about to say about the humor of this game is going to be neutral, bordering on positive. Personally, I found it hilarious. Almost everything in this game made me laugh really, really hard. Now, it is one of those games where the humor is edgy and uses some of the axioms that edgy comedians have, also, described and lived by, at least in their comedy. One of them is that we laugh at the wrong thing because we know what the right thing is. And another is this notion that true equality for minorities is to have harsh jokes about them, same as there are, telling harsh jokes about everybody else, about members of the majority. And obviously, one of the presumptions of the idea of we laugh at the wrong thing because we know what the right thing is the idea that we know what the right thing is. And some people these days, and in 2013, absolutely do not, and will laugh at edgy stuff just because they think it affirms their views, and they'll claim that's comedy while saying that we on the far left are not funny, which, I don't know. I mean, I feel like there's a lot of counterexamples to that. Yeah, okay, I think I will just very briefly... Yeah, Queen Coke Francis, Kaylin Conrad, there are a number of... I'm just mentioning some of my absolute favorites as, anyway. Very edgy, incredibly funny, far left. Now, I think so that brings us to the second axiom, which, in order for equality to include that kind of, mockery, that also kind of presumes that we are all on the same, like, I understand it. I 100% do. And I absolutely appreciate it. I'm not trying to talk over the ones who, members of minorities who love, jokes like that. And, a number of them make them themselves or laugh very hard and genuinely when others make them to their face and such. But it is also one of those cases where, it would be great if things were even enough for, that to be. But unfortunately, still, there are a number of people who, when they hear a joke about a minority they dislike, they consider that to be almost like a statement of truth about, that individual, that minority group. And I personally think we have to be careful to avoid just like tailoring our lives to, not, like, I don't think that we should only do things that will not be misunderstood by people who go out of their way to misunderstand things like that. That's extremely limiting. And, that is how, like, censorship can win. And dictators do love censorship. But, ultimately, I could... yeah, I think I've laid out both, as far as, but yeah. So this definitely does try to hit absolutely everyone. Like, it does have jokes about, minorities that are in a bad situation, but it definitely also has a number about cishet. Like, I would say some of the sickest burns in this game are definitely directed at, if not cishet white men as a group, then certainly specific individuals. And in at least one case, one that is quite powerful, so that does help make it less, like, to me, it doesn't really feel like this game is saying, oh, look at this minority, aren't they terrible? What I definitely did get the sense that this game felt was, we're all kind of ridiculous, like there was this kind of Monty Python-esque thing going on here. It felt like, yeah, we all have something really weird about us. Let's try to coexist, because, like, this is not a game where you run around, like, going out of your way to, you know, harm others. You help a lot, and, you know, there is a certain, I don't know, equalizing thing going on here where you will sometimes take something from someone who has a lot and give it to someone who has a little. And let's see. Yeah, it never really felt like downright mean-spirited or truly just like, you know, like there's a sense of immaturity to some of the humor, but not in a way where it's like, okay, they just like have a grudge against, people like this in the real world. There was a point where I saw, there were several characters all saying something that could be interpreted as negative about one other character, and I did briefly think, are we going there? But then I realized, oh, this is like hints. They're telling me what to do when I find that character, like how that character is perceived by others is part of the solution to the puzzle involving them. And I think that does pretty much. There's also very clear empathy towards people who are struggling with their mental health. You meet all different, kinds of people with varied problems. And yeah, like for, at least some of the humor, taking a edgy approach to, yeah, people who have such an issue. There were other times where, like, if once again, you help, a good amount of them. Like, I'm not sure there's even once where you just come across someone who's struggling with their mental health, and there's no like element of you helping in some way or another, or it explaining, once you find out, oh, this person is struggling with this, in retrospect, you're like, that's why they're kind of a jerk, So it's very, very humanizing to, minorities, people with various problems. And I also really liked, like, on more than one occasion, there was, I would encounter a character and they would say something that on its face sounded very strange. And then, I would realize that, that was not exactly what I had thought there. And that's as much as I can say without spoiling. But just, yeah, like it challenged my perceptions of the people in the game in a way that I found, just like watching far leftist YouTube has done for me many times over the years, decade and a half, I guess, by now. I know YouTube has been around for like 20 years by now, but I think the first time I watched like far left content on here was about 15 years ago. But yeah, the yeah, just learning more about what people are struggling with. And you know, I can imagine there are a number of people who play this game who are not going to spend hours and hours watching far left YouTube. So I really appreciate this game's value as helping promote empathy. And, it is technically right there in the core concept. You are reading minds, and also appreciate that that's like, there are times where you become aware of very private things, but it is not really this kind of like surveillance, you're being a creep kind of thing. It's that you are, learning about who these people are so that you can help them, so that you can solve problems. Like I actually found, on a non-zero number of occasions, I was helping someone where, like, you know, I wouldn't necessarily have thought that I'm going to be helping this person. They maybe seem like, not the very best person in the world, but then, I did something, helped them, and they actually really changed their demeanor. And, in retrospect, I was like, oh, right, they were acting out. They were behaving the way they were because they had a problem and they didn't know how to solve it. And this element that you are reading minds and then externally solving other people's problems, for them in order to proceed. Like, you cannot get very far in this game without solving other people's problems, reading their mind and solving their problems. That helps underline, hey, we are all human beings. We should be in community with each other as much as possible rather than trying to compete with each other. And there is a very clear, message here, theme here at least, of, some of the characters that come across as kind of jerks are very focused on competition and or make wrong choices within competition. I think that does pretty much cover. Yeah, so the camera is to the side and moves when you do, regardless of which direction you are headed in. The controls are very nice and easy. I already mentioned E and mouse clicking. WASD walks and jumps. M brings up the map. And, the clicking is always context sensitive. You can't accidentally do something you weren't trying to do. Well, I mean, hypothetically you could, but I don't think it ever happened for me. Like, they're always so distinct. And it's also like you can't really soft lock yourself in this game. You can't accidentally, I don't know, let's hypothetically say you're trying to read someone's mind, but you instead accidentally try to apply one of the thoughts. Right, it's part of the reason it's called Stick It to the Man is that the thoughts and objects are in the form of stickers that you place. You can't accidentally place something in a spot that it shouldn't be, and you can't, drop items or anything like that. And yeah, but other than reading minds and placing stickers, there is this element where you're tearing off the exterior of some buildings in order to, read minds, maybe place objects, grab stickers from inside there. And there's this thing where sometimes to transport, you have to grab onto something in order to, and then the arm will swing you there. And this is a good time for me to talk about the fact that in this, everything graphic, every element there is a paper cutout. And that's such a wonderful way to, because again, the game is in part about we're all kind of quirky. And that is a very quirky approach because, like, technically this could have been just like more traditional 2D animation or something. But the fact that you can tear off the side of a building, that makes sense if it's a paper cutout. And you can even see that, oh, the edge of the paper from the outside of that quote unquote building, I can tear that off by grabbing it, and the thing you grab onto in order to swing yourself somewhere is always one of those little pins that you put in things early in long far leftist YouTube video essays. And yeah, I think that does pretty well cover that. So the enemy design, there's not a huge amount of variety, but I felt there was just enough. The government agents will sometimes change appearance based on the specific place you find yourself, so that fits. And they very much have this kind of grunt, almost gorilla-like look, and not in like a dehumanizing way, but just like underlining, hey, they don't really. And also, when you read their minds and such, they don't really have a lot of independent thought. They're just cogs in a machine, and I do think that is something well worth criticizing, because in America, where this is set, I think, yeah, I actually forget if they specified, but it definitely read to me as America. There is this issue with law enforcement, military and such, just following orders. And yeah, the AI is good, and they have this element where when you are within the line of sight, you see that, let's see, I forget what y'all call that in American English, but I guess broken line, of the sight line, and it starts at the eyes of the agent and then, moves towards you. And if it reaches you, if the line is completed, then that agent becomes aware you're there and is going to chase you until he catches you or you escape that area. And I think I do want to briefly note, I felt they always did a good job of making the areas that you are chased through small enough that it doesn't become like just a hassle to deal with. And a number of them you only have to pass through once each. If you think that you have to pass through it more than once, you might just, have missed a shortcut that leads past, back past it in either direction, depending on where you came from. They're also very good about that. The levels are large enough that they're, it feels like, I hesitate to say the real world, because you never really forget that you're looking cardboard cutouts, and you're not meant to, but large enough that you feel, that there are puzzles where it will definitely be more beneficial to try to figure out what the solution is, rather than just, try to stick every sticker in every place you could stick it. You will always want to read every mind, though, and if you accidentally, if you start reading mine, then you're like, oh, right, I read this person's mind already, tap the jump key. Oh, did I mention jump key is spacebar? But yeah, so a lot of the time the stealth is, you realize where you're going to which, the map is always going to make it very, very clear what place is the goal for you to get to, by the stealth. And you're figuring out a way to get there without them catching you. And they move just fast enough that it's challenge, but not so fast that it's, excessively so. And it's also, like, it's not super punishing. There tends to be save checkpoints right before and right after a stealth section, so you don't have to replay a lot if you fail. And once you know how to get through a stealth section, I'd say the longest is probably less than 1 entire minute, And obviously it might take multiple attempts. I think the longest was less than half a dozen. And I appreciate, I've played stealth so many times over the years, but even so, there are some stealth games where I will sometimes struggle. But yeah, if you move to break the broken line before it's completed, then that agent will not know where you are. And this also means that the further distance you're able to keep, which is not always up to you, the more time you have to get away from there. Some guards will just stand in place, maybe have their head on a swivel. Others will patrol. And I really appreciate it. If you try to read the minds of a patrolling one who has a sticker, if he walks off screen, the sticker will just appear. I really appreciated that was, yeah. And I think that might just about cover. Yeah, so I also quite appreciated the inventory. Like many other point and click puzzle games, this one does have this element of, you can find out, you can get a general description of any item you're carrying in your inventory. And in this one, you don't even have to click anything. You just you use the mouse wheel to scroll through the stickers you have available, and the way to get a description is just to stand in place and scroll to a specific sticker. And yes, you can do this even if you only have one sticker. Trying to scroll will just bring up the one sticker. And if you don't want to hear it, just take one step in either direction or jump or something. That's all. I think that does pretty well cover. I will say the element of moving, so you're always walking side to side and jumping and such, but the element of the W and S keys where you can use them to go a little closer to the background, a little further away from the background, I have to say ultimately I think that was used a tiny bit too little, because there were times where I actually struggled to figure out what I was supposed to do, and then I was like, oh right, I can walk through the, that's an option. Now I think that does bring us nicely to so yeah, essentially the game is almost nothing but fetch quests. Everywhere you go, you find out you're supposed to go to another part of the same overall area, the same map, get a sticker and come back here. And sometimes you'll go to get a sticker and then you'll find out, oh, I have to go a third place to get a sticker there in order to get the sticker I need from that person. It is mostly linear. There are a couple of puzzles that you can solve in any order you feel like. And yeah, the atmosphere, I thought it struck a really good balance between this kind of lighthearted approach to essentially almost everything. Like, there are some very morbid jokes here, and I really appreciated that it, once again, like, it's not particularly mean-spirited. Like, there was at least once where I came across something that, in theory, on paper, cut out, should be like really upsetting, but then there's actually, like, one thing is that there's a joke that makes it not seem so bad, and also you get to help this person who is in a really, a scenario that, like, in real life would be kind of like a horror movie. And the yeah, other than that, it's got, oh wait, I guess that does describe the atmosphere pretty well. Yeah, there's some darkness, but there's also a light tone and touch. Ray can worry a lot, and they do this great thing where, like, at times he's being a little ridiculous, but at other times it's like, well, no wonder he's worried about that, and it is a world that can be hostile to him and others, and I once again, the Pride reading, the issue of whether or not his new condition is mental illness is brought up and taken seriously as an actual theme here. I wasn't sure how much time they were going to spend on it, and ultimately I'm not going to give away how much, but it was more than one might immediately think, and I personally felt it was enough to really underline, because like, once again, you meet characters who do have mental illnesses, and it's very humanizing towards them. It is not a game that's like, it's a game that acknowledges that mental health care can sadly be weaponized against minorities, and that's not to say that mental health care is always bad, and the game doesn't, I mean, clearly is not saying that. It's, perhaps arguing that sometimes, something unusual is a better solution, and we have to be careful to not, you know, overdiagnose, over-medicate, things like that. But it is, very much saying, yeah, when, like, as we go through life, we will encounter problems, and we should try to work together to solve those problems. And sometimes it takes someone with, something unusual, a different perspective to help solve them. And let's see, yeah, it is a world that can be hostile towards minorities and, including those with mental illness, but there's also a lot of positive. Like, you do encounter a number of people who either are happy or you can make them happy. Problems in this game are meant to be solved, and there's at least one character who seems reluctant to even consider solving their problems, and it doesn't really... Yeah, I'm keeping it spoiler free. I'll just say that is definitely something the game wants the player to think about. And yeah, the cutscenes are all in-engine, and let's see, I think that might just be right. None of them are over long. So I've talked some about the graphics already, but I did want to say a bit more. I love the way that the animation has, characters moving in a way that really betrays the fact that this is paper cutouts. Like, they kind of, if you've dealt with paper cutouts, you know that they can kind of, especially if you don't reinforce it enough, if you've made like a little standee thing, it can kind of sway, and that's kind of part of the movement of this. They will just, the top half might sway as they're moving, and maybe that's, for example, when they're turning and such. And did I already mention the tops of heads will, for at least some characters, move up and down like, South Park Canadians when they talk. And it's also just a very memorable style, and I'm not just talking about the fact that it is, paper cutouts, but yeah, like, I'm gonna remember a lot of the unique character looks here for quite some time now. There's so much personality there. It doesn't feel like they were holding back at all. And I really admire how, like, you might almost say nearly every character feels like one of those kind of, harsh, sarcastic, what are those called again? Those I don't know if they're called portraits, but the kind of thing where, that episode of The Simpsons where Lisa ends up feeling ugly because someone's, the kind of drawing that she receives that makes her feel ugly, with exaggerated features and such. That's the art style here, and yet it doesn't really feel like it's saying that, oh, look at this really conventionally unattractive person, because, like, everyone in this game is conventionally unattractive. So it's essentially saying, listen, beauty's in the eye of the beholder. Like, we all look, weird in some way or another, and when everyone's special, no one will be. By which I mean, it's saying, hey, we should accept people who look different. I very much got a vibe of this game of like, hey, judge behavior, not appearance. And let's see, I think that brings us nicely to the audio design, which is also great. Like the sound of tearing off the side of a building, the the smack of placing a sticker, and the voice acting is great through and through. A lot of it is primarily comedic, but there is just enough there of like actual drama. I genuinely cared about the major characters here. And I think that does. Right, I also appreciated, so there are female characters here and, other minorities where it's like, okay, that's, negative stereotype about people from that, community. But as I played more and more, I realized there's actually plenty of positive depiction of members of that community. I mean, I wouldn't really say that this is like misogynistic and just hates all women so much as kind of just saying, hey, this is something some women do and it's bad, and this other thing is what other women do and that's good. So, that's something to maybe think about, kind of, and once again, like, it has very harsh, honest words for a number of cishet white men as well. It is absolutely not saying that men are better. Let's see. I think that does pretty much cover. Yeah, also just the general sound design. There is this kind of goofy, weird vibe to a lot of the choices made there that really works. And the music is also great. I'm not just talking about the fantastic theme song that plays, but the which I absolutely cannot get out of my head right now. But yeah, throughout the game, like, it is tense and exciting when you are in a stealth section being chased, and it's got a more relaxed vibe when you're just exploring and such. Right, I don't want to give them away, but I wanted to note that during stealth, I felt like they had just enough different elements at play that helped make, it remained fresh throughout. Like, there was never a time where it was just like, ugh, another stealth section. And, even as much as I love stealth, there are games where that's been my reaction. And I think that does bring us. So yeah, the stealth and the platforming do at times get challenging. Personally, I think they're on the right side of, like, they're sufficiently rewarding, and personally, I never felt like just at a complete loss as to what I was supposed to do. Like, there were times where during stealth, I couldn't quite make it far enough through the section to see exactly how to get, like, I knew what direction I was going, but exactly how to get to the other side, to the safe place. But as I applied myself more, it is one of those where you don't want to get impatient. If you have to sneak carefully past, it doesn't, to be clear, I'm not saying it's one of those that take a long time. This is not, one of the thief games where you might have to wait for a while for a patrol or something. But there were times where, yeah, you may have to get a decent chunk through a stealth section before you're spotted, before the chase starts. And right, I also really appreciate, so the thing with the paper cutouts, if you are, if you perish in this game, the save checkpoints are these like printing press kind of things, and once you've activated, right, and it's also one of those games where you activate them. There were times where I was like, I don't really need to activate this one because, for whatever reason. But whenever you want to, usually the first time you encounter one, you will activate it. But you have to walk right past it, and that will activate it. But there are times where they put one slightly off to the side, and it's an area you've already visited, or could be an area you've already visited. But yeah, you will be printed back there, and there's infinite lives, and it's within seconds. So and there are so many of them. I never had to walk very far to get back to the area where I perished from one of those presses. And but yeah, and it's also fun that if you fall into water, like waves are paper cutouts that are moving, being puppeteered to move as if they are like waves, for example. And if you're caught by an agent, they will zap you, you know, and then you're reprinted. Now, the yeah, I think that does cover that very nicely. Yeah, so the replayability is not huge. I did notice, it does have a level selector or chapter selector, and if I looked at that after completing the game, and it does track, like there are, let's see, I think it might have been Mines Red or something like that, and there are areas where, you know, yeah, where it keeps track. So, maybe you'll go back and do the rest of those, but it does not really have much else. And I don't think that that's a problem. It's just something to note. Like, this is, as others have noted, maybe make sure to get this on sale, if you didn't get it free on Epic. I would not have been unhappy paying money for this, but I would have wanted a pretty significant discount. But then that's kind of how I acquire games anyway. I did not run into any actual bugs or glitches. Like, there were times where, I already mentioned the thing about missing jumps, but it's not really, like, it's not really a bug or a glitch. It is essentially just, yeah, the smoothness could perhaps use a tiny bit of adjustment, but it's not like I got stuck where I landed, or that I should really have landed, but then somehow there was like an invisible obstacle or something. Never that. The setting is sufficiently varied. Here you start just in the city and moving through parts of the city, but you also go to specific other places that I don't think I really want to give away, but I felt I was never bored with where I was in the game. And yeah, the level design is quite good. Like, the levels are not so open as to be overwhelming, but not so closed that it felt like you just have no freedom of movement at all. And I also appreciated the map doesn't just show the geography, it also has these little indicators of like, oh hey, there's something here that you could maybe do something with. So, yeah, if you really badly want to always know, like personally, I like to just try to go everywhere that the game will allow me and figure out. But I appreciate some people prefer to have at least somewhat more guidance, and in large games that is necessary. This one isn't a large game, but it does still have that. And it also doesn't, like, there was a while where I didn't look at the map at all. It wasn't until the first time I got lost that I looked at the map. But yeah, if you want, you can just bring up the map as soon as you enter a level, see what you want to go to. There's these like question marks on the map. Yeah, go to the nearest question mark and work your way from there, if that is what you want. And yeah, there are some, what's the word, like distinct puzzles, and there's at least a little bit of evolution that takes place there, but by and large, it does stay very much the same. Like, essentially, what changes for the puzzles over the course of the game, to a certain extent, is there are more minds to read, stickers to place, and places to place stickers, and that's about it. So, yeah, hopefully I have by now helped you determine if this is your kind of game. I personally am very, very happy to have played it. The ending was fantastic, and yeah, I think that does pretty well cover it. Yeah, so I rate this 8 unusual helping pink invisible spaghetti hands solving problems everywhere Ray goes out of 10.